Hello, 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 everybody, and happy Tuesday. And thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Let's Talk About Shh. For those of you joining us for the very first time, this is a live podcast where we talk about sex, relationships, and intimacy, and all that good stuff connected to it. So, who am I? My name is Tila. I'm a sex educator, relationship expert, and published author. I love talking about sex. I love talking about sex ed. I love talking about relationships and all that good stuff. And I love helping people connect with that part of themselves and answer all of those questions. I see a bunch of people tuning in on Instagram. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. If you do want to see the whole show, please tune in on Twitch, YouTube, or Facebook. The link is in the bio, okay? Because you're not going to see everything that we're doing. So, as I mentioned, this is a live podcast, which means I love your comments. I love it when you guys tune in. I love it when you guys call in. You guys can absolutely call in with your questions, comments, and thoughts. But we want to make sure we're having a nice, safe community here. We want to build a nice, positive community. As a sex educator, I have heard all kinds of questions regarding, people have different levels of knowledge and different levels of interest in sex and relationships and all that stuff. So there's no such thing as a stupid question. So if somebody asks a question, you're like, wow, why are they asking that? Please be respectful and supportive in your comments, okay? So moving on, we're going to open up the phone lines now. Hopefully everybody's doing okay. So if you do want to call with a thought or question or comment, the number, of course, is toll free at 1-877-777-5589. And if you want to call in at any point and it's not related, and you have something you want to ask that's not related to what we're talking about, please feel free to call in. Callers are our number one priority, of course, and we can always go back to the topic at hand. All right, I love all the people tuning in on Instagram. Welcome to your first live. Okay, so today's topic is don't use that fucking word, the power of language. So language matters a great deal. It's how we communicate and express ourselves and how we share ideas with others. It's how we make people feel good and express affection. It's also how we offend people. There's lots of room for miscommunication and misunderstandings that come up because of bad language or bad communication skills. It is a huge aspect of our lives, and it plays a huge role in sex and relationships too. Now, language is pretty tricky because it does tend to evolve over time. Words and phrases take on, different shades of meaning. How people use them and what tone we use them is how, those words and languages or words and phrases change over time. We develop new and deeper meanings for things based on how people tend to use them. Sort of that subtext that we tune into. So throughout history, there's always been classes of words or phrases that have sort of been considered taboo. Usually these phrases are referred to forbidden acts or things that are considered not polite to talk about. An obvious one that comes to mind. Anybody? Fuck. Yeah, that's a good one. Fuck actually traces its origins back to Germanic. It's related to Dutch, German, and Swedish words for to strike or to move back and forth. Does anybody know when the first record of using the word fuck appeared? Anybody? It's earlier than you think. I was surprised, actually, when I looked it up, finding out when people first started using the word fuck. It was actually back in the 15th century, and it appeared in the believe it or not, the writings of monks, monks and scholars. And sometimes it was used in frustration, and sometimes it was used to actually describe the act of intercourse. And by the late 16th century, it was actually included in dictionaries, also in dictionaries like translating one language to another. So that's pretty cool. But back in its time, it was not really considered a swear word. It was just an impolite and direct way of saying intercourse, right? So today, of course, the word fuck has evolved to mean a variety of things. You know, it can, its meaning can be totally changed on how we use it or the tone that we use it in. I don't know if anybody has ever seen Boondock Saints. Have you guys seen that movie, Boondock Saints? It's a few years old. I think it's 1999, I want to say, or maybe early 2000s. Anyway, there's a scene in there where one of the characters swears and just says nothing but fuck for about like a minute, maybe 2 minutes. And one of the other characters comments immediately after that, well, that certainly illustrates the diversity of the word, because of all the different ways that he used it and tone and just, yeah. So, you know, it's come to mean a lot in our current society and language. But it's funny because people still consider it a pretty vulgar word. And, you know, there's lots of different opinions about it. Like there's a whole school of thought that advocates that swear words such as fuck are best to be avoided, that they denote low character or intelligence. There's also some articles and studies that support the idea that only people of high in intelligence swear a lot, and it's actually a sign of high intelligence. You know, the reality is that with language, and swear words, of course, are included in this, you know, it's the words have the power that we give them. So our intention and how we use them gives them power. So we develop histories with certain words and phrases, and how we were raised and what cultural influence impacted us and our experiences with communicating with other people. You know, it flavors how we see certain words and how we see certain language. And it's why words can sometimes hurt us. And it's also why words may be meaningless to us. And this is why it's so important that we choose our words with care, and why they're so important in communication, because everybody has that different history. Everybody has a different take on specific types of language. And depending on personal history, words can be very triggering, you know, particularly if they're associated with past trauma, or maybe they might be considered stigmatizing. We see this a lot for words around minorities, whether it's LGBTQ or with racism. There's a lot of words that have been deliberately used to discriminate against other people. And those words leave a feeling on us, right? What words somebody uses to describe someone else says a lot about what they think about those people. And I actually had an interesting argument with someone on Instagram recently. Hello, Instagram fam. And I had posted a meme talking about the difference, the morality difference between sex workers and coal miners, which are two professions that place a lot of risk on themselves and take a toll on the body for different reasons. And someone on my Instagram was like, well, that's BS, you know, people are the choices they make. And, you know, so obviously and just the way that this person was speaking was actually quite disrespectful. And a lot of the words that they were using, you know, describing sex workers, unfortunately, in very derogatory terms, using words like prostitute, which is a very common word that a lot of people use, but is actually quite discriminatory. It has a lot of negative connotations to it, which is why we actually say sex worker. There's a long history with the word prostitute. It's a very heavy word, and it denotes a lot of discrimination. Is that making sense so far? You guys still with me? Still with me? Yeah, doing okay? You guys are a quiet bunch today. Anyway, so, you know, how this person was speaking was entirely disrespectful based on their beliefs. And when I asked, you know, what makes these people less worthy of respect, the response I got was, well, I never said they shouldn't be respected. And it's like, well, actually, you kind of did. You implied it with the words, with your choice of words that you used. You know, using phrases like pieces of shit. That's a very heavy and laden term, you know. People have very specific ideas of what comes to mind when you refer to people in that manner. And it makes a big difference on how people are viewed, right? If you look at other aspects more relating to LGBTQ, you know, there's certain terms, like, for example, gay. There was a time in history where that was an extremely negative term, and it very severely impacted people. And in some places in the world and some societies, it's still a fairly heavy term, and it's still very derogatory, or seen as very derogatory. And in some senses, it's still used that way too. In the last, I'd say, 20, 30 years, that term has been reclaimed by the LGBTQ community and redefined to be something different, as an affirmation. Same thing has sort of happened with terms like butch or dyke. Something that has been used as a derogatory term has been reclaimed and redefined by the group that it applies to. This is why, like I said, language is very important, and it plays a huge role in our relationships. A lot of people will think that, well, they don't have to be careful with their words. You know, they don't have to be careful on how they say things, because the person who's listening should just understand what they mean. That's not really how communication works. If you want to be clearly understood, it's your job to communicate clearly. So the words we have, or the words that we choose, can impact our relationships negatively. Whether it's a fight that we have with our partner, or maybe, you know, how we interact with our friend, how we choose, what terms we choose, can declare ourselves as someone safe to open up to, safe to talk to, or it can basically show that we are not someone safe, or perhaps maybe we're just uneducated because we don't understand or haven't learned about the heaviness of certain terms, like, for example, prostitute versus sex worker. Is that making sense so far? How are we doing? Now, all this talk about language and what words we use is really to remind us that we have the power to empower or, you know, take the power away from certain words. They only have as much weight as we give them. And I know that can be quite difficult at times. It's not always easy when people say hurtful things to just shrug it off and be like, well, it doesn't mean anything. Because clearly they meant something by it. But we can choose how we interact and how we change our history with those words, if that makes sense. So, like I said, that sort of feeds back into the reclaiming of certain language and how we utilize it. Now, all of this sort of plays a big role into gender identity. There's a lot of discussion about language and how we should talk about gender when we're talking about sex and relationships. And lots of people have a lot of resistance to the change in language because they don't see it's necessary, or maybe they don't understand, or they just don't understand the changes in language. Sometimes that happens too, you know. A lot of people struggle with the idea of moving beyond the gender binary because when they were raised, they were taught, well, the gender binary, you know, male, female, that's it, right? There's so many things that we learn as children that are not exactly correct, in the sense that there is more to those subjects than that. It's not just these things. It's a simplified version that we tell young people, or we tell people with less knowledge, or less capacity to handle lots of knowledge, just so it's not confusing, so we can introduce them to the base ideas. The problem is that when it comes to gender, we've been stuck in this one idea for so long, that people have actually, like, for example, the scientific field for the longest time ignored scientific evidence that didn't fit the gender binary. They just categorized it as an anomaly and moved on. And they didn't take into effect that there was a lot of anomalies, like a whole bunch of them, that were just not studied and not categorized. And that sort of fed into some of this problem that we have. And how we talk about gender language can be inclusive or not. It's one of the big things that I've been sort of discussing when we discuss sex ed is how do you refer to anatomy terms? People default to his, hers, so on and so forth, but that's not exactly inclusive, and it's not really the case, anymore, or ever really. We're just more aware of it now, and there's been more discussion around it, which is good. But we need to think about how we talk about gendered anatomy in terms of being more inclusive. And we need to talk about, normalizing things like talking about pronouns. People feel that that's awkward, but the reality is that it's not. It only feels awkward because it's a new skill and it's not comfortable yet. But it just takes a little practice to get used to. And this is what I mean about using the power of language, using the power of language to accept people, right? Does that make sense? How are we doing? Anybody have any thoughts about anything I've said so far? I know I have a horrible tendency of talking exceptionally quickly and not giving you guys enough chance to jump in there. No thoughts so far? All right. So using inclusive language is a matter of practice. We have to keep learning. We have to keep finding new terms. Sometimes that's challenging for conversations that haven't had enough discussion yet. When I published my book 3 years ago, when I was writing my book, which would have been 3.5 years ago, almost 4 now. But when I was working on my book, and my book is, for anybody who doesn't know, Got Consent. It's all about sexual consent. And writing a book about consent really made me appreciate the number of, or I guess not really, well, the number of ways we can say consent, and actually the lack of language that we have to describe consent. So I'm just seeing an Instagram comment. Thanks for commenting. I love it when people comment. I wish it showed up in the video feed, but Says, are there any gender-related books I can use to educate my child? There's more than just male and female. And as far as children's books, there are some on the market. I don't have any immediately in front of me, but I will put out a list for you. I'll publish it with a write-up for this episode. But a good book that I recommend everybody read that talks about biological diversity and humanity and the animal kingdom is called, I always want to say it's biological, but it's not. It's Evolutionary Rainbow. If you just search Evolution's Rainbow, you'll come across it, and it's an excellent book that sort of discusses all the different scientific facts. Like I said, not necessarily a book for kids specifically, but I do have a list. I just don't, sorry to say, I don't have it in front of me, but I will publish it with this episode. So when you check out the episode write-up, there'll be some recommendations there for you. So as I was saying, with writing my book about consent and, the lack of language that we had to sort of talk about some of these concepts, so it's actually made it really difficult to write. And I think it's interesting that since I wrote the book 3.5, 4 years ago, and now there is so much more in terms of terminology and language and the way we talk about it. And, I think it's great. Like, we have to continue to having these conversations and defining new terms and having new terminology and language for things. And that's one of the ways that we move concepts forward as well. So I know I started this podcast talking about swear words and inappropriate words, but they're only as inappropriate as we deem them to be. The more power we give swear words, the more offense we give swear words, the more offensive they're going to be. Since we are talking a little bit about kids and education, I'm a huge advocate that if you don't want your kids to swear, take the power out of swear words. Don't give a big reaction. You know, if your kid drops an F-bomb and you have a humongous reaction to it, they're going to be like, wow, this gets a really big reaction. This is something to remember. You know, if they drop an F-bomb and you're just like, hey, that's not appropriate language. You know, just keep it low key, right? They're more likely to dismiss the word. Well, that didn't get much of a reaction. What's the point of using it? Right? So how we react plays a difference as well. And like I said, language is incredibly complicated, but so important to our relationships. That's sort of all I wanted to chat about today in terms of language and swear words, which is, you know, always a fun topic. Who doesn't love to drop a bunch of F-bombs? I once dropped one in a live TV interview once. I was kind of embarrassed. I kind of forgot. Yeah. It was funny. We all had a good laugh about it. But anyway, so moving into final thoughts. Once again, for everybody joining us for the first time, this is a weekly podcast. It is broadcast live to Facebook, Twitch, and YouTube. And recorded episodes are also uploaded to my Instagram TV. And then you can also download the audio off of Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, all those usual places. So if you want to catch up on past episodes. Please share, like, comment, engage. Let me know you're out there. If you have topics that you'd like to see in the future, please let me know. You can shoot me an email or send me a social media message for sure. And next week, we're actually going to be talking about cheating and what to do if you suspect that your spouse or partner is cheating, and what sort of conversations and what we can do about that. So that's next Tuesday, July 14th. And of course, we broadcast at 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. Eastern. Sorry we're a little late today. There was a little bit of tech issues getting going. Always with the tech issues, the joys of technology. But I really appreciate everybody tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion of language. And if you are just tuning in and maybe just catching the end, check out the replay. Anyway, I hope you guys have a fantastic week, and I look forward to seeing you all